Hearing everybody. Now, welcome to the vocabulary lesson. Now, we are on the vocabulary lesson 84. The 84th vocabulary lesson. Hold on for 1 second. The two words that we're going to be talking about, which is restriction, restricted, impulse, impulsive. We're going to be talking about restriction and impulse. That's what we're going to be talking about, So here we go. Restriction means a limiting condition or measure, especially a legal one. Planning restrictions on commercial development. Synonyms: reduction, limitation, diminution, and curtailment. Wow, that's a newest word for me I never heard of before. curtailment. The restriction of personal freedom, the limitation or control of someone or something, or the state of being limited or restricted. The restriction of local government power. The restriction of local government power. That's the one. Synonyms: limitation, limit, constraint, control, check, curb, condition, proviso, qualification. There is no restriction on the number of places. Something that restricts a restrictive condition or regulation, limitation. The act of restricting, the state of being restricted. The restriction came as a shock to Jarar, who frequently travels to his many international exhibitions. The restriction on the use of hands decried by some soccer objectors, including myself, until we beat Genau, is sensible. The hardest condition to live with for Pateromo. Never heard of that before. Bartiromo. Bartiromo was the internet restriction. Restriction means the act of restricting or the state of being restricted, a regulation or a limitation that restricts. Restrict means to restrain within bounds, to limit, to confine, as to restrict worlds to a particular meaning, to restrict a patient to a certain diet, to consider a function as defined on a subset of its original domain. Restriction means put something to stop a bit. The worker had placed a restriction on the roads. Restriction means only allowed by select people. Civilians are restricted from entering the Pentagon. Government properties have many restrictions. Restriction means like you're not allowed. Restriction means 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 you're not allowed. One last time. Restriction means you're not allowed. Area 51 is a restricted area. Restriction, a limiting condition or measure, especially a legal one. Planning restrictions on commercial development. Also, the limitation or control of someone or something, or the state of being limited or restricted. The restriction of local government power. Both these propositions were with some restrictions. Sorry about that. With some restrictions secured, it came, however, to be the practice to impose some restrictions as on clerks twice married. About the middle of the century, restrictions upon the press began to disappear. Restriction means a limit or ban of something, to have a rule against something. There is a restriction to how much calories you can eat. Restriction means Restriction means when you don't allow something or someone to do a certain thing. Restrict means past tense of restriction. We are currently having COVID restrictions. Restriction means it's forbidden. Restriction means it's forbidden. That means not allowed. Restriction means it's not allowed. Restriction means it's forbidden. Forbidden means not allowed. Restricted means limited or banned. The playground was restricted from kids to play on. Restriction means not allowed. There's restrictions on what you could and could not. Restriction means a limit on something. The age restriction for drinking is 21. Restrict means to limit. I restrict you from playing with that dog. Restriction means is a limitation or control over something or someone. The government SETS. Oh, no. The government sets a restriction on the age someone is allowed to have alcohol. Restricted means to put a limit on something. The city restricts how many people can be together during COVID-19. A limiting condition or measure, especially a legal one. Planning restrictions on commercial development. The limitation or control of someone or something, or the state of being limited or restricted. The restriction of local government power, something that restricts, such as a regulation that restricts or restrains. Restrictions for hunters, a limitation on the use or enjoyment of property or a facility, an act of restricting, the condition of being restricted. So that word is done. So the next word I'm going to do, which is impulse and impulsive. All right, here we go. Impulse means a sudden, strong, and unreflective urge or desire to act. I had an almost irresistible impulse to giggle. Synonyms: urge, instinct, drive, compulsion, need, itch, whim, caprice, desire, fancy, notion. She had an impulse to run and hide somewhere. A driving or motivating force. An, an impetus, an added impulse to this process of renewal. Synonyms: inspiration, stimulation, stimulus, incitement, motivation, encouragement, fillip, spur, prod, catalyst. Passions provide the main impulse of poetry and music. The influence of a particular feeling, mental state, etc., to act under a generous impulse, to strike out at someone from an angry impulse, sudden, involuntary inclination, prompting to action, to be swayed by impulse. An instance of this, a psychic drive or instinctual urge, marked by or acting on impulse. An impulse buyer, bought or acquired on impulse. To reduce expenses, shun impulse items when shopping. Impulse means something you do without thinking. 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 One last time. Impulse means something you do without thinking. I jumped off the roof without thinking, and that was impulse, which is impulse. Impulse means you do it without thinking. Impulse means you do it without thinking. By doing stupid things, that's an impulse. This lady had an impulse, which means it's not smart by thinking. Impulse means a sudden, strong, and unreflective urge or desire to act. An impulse is a sudden, strong, and unreflective urge or desire to act. Impulse means to do things too rapidly with the false hope of not achieving what should be done. Impulsive means in a given scenario, we can give ourselves a goal and work towards it to limit what is not warranted. Impulse means to react naturally to someone or something. A mother's natural impulse is to protect her baby. Impulse is the change of momentum of an object when the object is acted upon by a force for an interval of time. So with impulse, you can calculate the change in momentum, or you can use impulse to calculate the average impact force of a collision. The formula for impulse is impulse, force, time, force, delta, actuated or swayed by emotional or involuntary impulses. An impulsive child. All right, impulsive. acting or done without forethought. They had married as young, impulsive teenagers. Synonyms: impetuous, spontaneous, hasty, passionate, emotional, uninhibited, unrepressed, abandoned, rash, reckless, foolhardy, madcap, devil may care, daredevil, hot-headed, wild, daring, adventurous. He had an impulsive nature. Synonyms: impromptu, snap, spontaneous, unpremeditated, spur of the moment, extemporaneous, impetuous, precipitate, hasty, headlong, rash, reckless, incautious, imprudent, injudicious, sudden, quick, ill-considered, ill-thought, out, unplanned, thoughtless, unthinking. His impulsive decision to leave his job and join the army. Physics: acting as an impulsive, acting or done suddenly without any planning or consideration of the results. She's an impulsive shopper and often buys things she doesn't need. Impulsively is an adverb, showing behavior in which you do things suddenly without any planning and without considering the effects they may have. Don't be so impulsive. Think before you act. An impulsive man. Decision. Gesture. You are so impulsive and pushy. Impulsive means you do something without thinking. Impulsive means you do something without thinking. Impulsive means you do something without thinking. And again, impulsive means you do something without thinking. One last time. Impulsive means you do something without thinking. I jumped out of a moving car and that was impulsive. Impulsive means you do some stupid things without thinking. Impulsive means acting or done without forethought. Anything impulsive is acting or done without forethought. Alan is very impulsive. It means doing it without thinking, with no patience. Impulsive means to react naturally to someone or something, normally in a fast manner. UFC fighters have to react impulsively during their fights. Impulsive means too pushy. My mom is being impulsive, meaning too pushy. Impulsive means out of control. Our goal is to make customers to make impulsive purchases. Make something right away without thinking about it. To make impulsive decisions. Showing behavior in which you do things suddenly without any planning and without considering the effects they may have. Don't be so impulsive. Think before you act. An impulsive man. Decision, gesture. Doing things or trending to do things suddenly and without careful thought. Acting or attending to act on impulsive. Done suddenly and without planning, resulting from a sudden impulse. That's it, folks. Hope you guys enjoy the lesson.